Why'd you get out of there so quick, Mr. Murdaugh?
Because it was chaotic, it was hot, and I was getting ready to do exactly what I didn't want to do.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Do you believe Stephen Smith was murdered in July 2015? Do you believe, if you believe that, do you believe the person who murdered, or persons who murdered Stephen Smith have gotten away with murder? In this episode, we're going to deal with the Murdaugh mythos. We're going to deal with this whole business of untangling this tangled web that Alex Murdaugh, by his own admission, wove. Just how tangled was it? Just how far back do we need to go? And which sort of lives got tangled up in that web? And I think as a way of dealing with this, we are obviously going to deal with this via the second episode of the HBO documentary series. But I think as a way of going into it, I think we could ask the question, why do clever people make stupid mistakes? Well, I think it's because clever people do some stupid things and get away with it. And then they do that same stupid thing again and get away with it. And they do the same stupid thing again and get away with it. And eventually they do the same stupid thing again and they don't get away with it. And then you ask, why do clever people make stupid mistakes? Well, what happened along the way? What happened along the way, tangling, setting up this tangled web, weaving this tangled web? Why does a lawyer who knows the law break the law? Isn't it because he does that, maybe by mistake in the beginning, and gets away with it? Does it again, gets away with it. Does it again, gets away with it, and then starts breaking it in a bigger way and knows he can get away with it, and then expects to get away with it. Think about it in a general sense. Why does someone who's climbed Mount Everest 12 times, he knows the rules back and forth, why would he break his own rules? You saw that in the 96 Everest disaster. And the answer is hubris. Hubris. It's incredible that for all the Murdaugh's influence, for all his efforts, Alex Murdaugh's efforts to control a silly little random video surreptitiously recorded by his own 22-year-old son was his undoing. Of all things, the great king of Hampton County, South Carolina, is undone by a dog, or a video of a dog, more specifically, its injured tail. We may see another product of the criminal law system undone by a dog as well, perhaps a dog hair. And, we can all stand on the sidelines pointing and jeering, entertained by these life-altering revelations. We can shout guilty, as if hubris applies to everyone else aside from ourselves. But that's hubris too. We don't want to fall into that trap. So what follows is a few insights from episode 2 of the HBO docu-series. What do these insights tell us about the Murdaugh case that we don't already know? And what does it possibly tell us about this idea of their hubris? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. You can also join the True Crime Rocket Science community on Patreon. By the way, I'll be following this episode with I think, is it episode 39 in the Gogh Letters series. It's really getting pretty interesting. So if you haven't watched that yet, watch this episode, where Van Gogh really sort of lets his hair down in Paris and starts to become kind of a naughty boy and sets the ball for his future, for his fate, sets that rolling. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. Alex Murdaugh's law firm specialized in personal injury. That's the first insight. Did you know that? If someone asked you, what did Alex Murdaugh's firm actually do? Specifically, would you know the answer? And so the answer is, and it's not just that's the answer, let's go on to the next thing. What does this mean? It means that Murdaugh's firm made money out of the misfortunes of others. It literally spun straw into gold. It made hay from the inevitable misfortunes that dog people at some point in their world, and it used the insurance companies as money spinners. In a very crude way, it's turning feces into gold coins. And so you need both. You need feces as well. So what at the end of the day is insurance? Insurance is managing risk. But in a more basic way, it's being compensated or rewarded for risks coming to fruition. That thing that you are afraid of happening does actually take place. Somebody does get injured. Somebody does get hurt. Somebody does die. It's only when that happens that the insurance pays out. So you need that to happen. You need there to be feces. Now imagine working in an environment like that. Somebody falls, somebody dies, there's some kind of accident, some kind of crash, and then you take your percentage. Every time someone is injured or killed, you have got to try not to rub your hands in public because you're about to get your pound of flesh. Now in a scenario like that, if you're greedy, why wouldn't you begin to imagine situations where someone might fall and you get everything? Something that hasn't happened yet, but you imagine it could happen and how much you could get. You could actually use that system to get rich much quicker than waiting for these things to happen. And it's perfect because the dead can't talk. The dead can't contradict you. The dead can't say, but I didn't sign this. And we get all of that insight into the criminal psychology just by looking at the type of firm, the type of law Murdaugh was practicing. But what more than this? So how do you manage risk when certain things might come to light? How do you manage that? Such as your finances. Well, how do you manage the risk in these insurance situations? Well, that person's died. And so how do you manage risk in a situation where certain information could come to light after the fact? Perhaps when your finances aren't so great. How do you spin straw into gold in those circumstances, or keep spinning it? Now, according to Fitz News, quote, Colleton County probate documents filed in the particular month that this article is written reveal a troubling financial state for Maggie Murdaugh, the 52-year-old mother of two, who was known to flaunt expensive clothes and purses. And that's a really well-written article and one that we could also spend some time looking at. Maggie's finances. In any event, the article refers to John Marvin Murdaugh, Maggie Murdaugh's brother-in-law, and that's obviously Alex's brother, younger brother, was made personal representative of her estate, of Maggie's estate, in the last year. This was after apparently Maggie's sister's name was scratched off as a personal representative, and somebody wrote Randolph Murdaugh III's name in the 2005 will. So although we can't prove there was a life insurance policy in Maggie's name, we do know that Maggie's bank accounts were cleaned out. One had, I think, $58 in it. Another one had $17 in it. And we also know that after selling Moselle to Maggie for $5 in 2016, Murdaugh inherited it right back after she died. We also know that the Murdaugh firm was in the business of reaping profits from insurance. And so why on earth was Alex's brother Maggie's executor instead of her sister? Right? When she died. Why did that change? How did that change? That brings us to the second insight. Hampton County is a prejudiced community. These aren't my words. These are the words from the documentary, from someone in that documentary. And it's prejudiced specifically in terms of sexual orientation. So Stephen Smith was a openly gay kid who died in strange and unusual circumstances. The fuel cap of his vehicle was open and dangling outside the vehicle as if to say, I ran out of fuel, that's why I'm sitting out here. And what's quite interesting with the Netflix docuseries is they dramatize a vehicle, whereas in HBO you see the actual vehicle on scene. You see those crime scene photos. You also see photos of Stephen Smith at the scene. Some of them are blurred out, and also autopsy photos in the HBO docuseries. His sister's response to this situation of running out of gas is, well, why didn't he call me? Because he's called me plenty of times. He had his phone with him. Why didn't he just call me? I've run out of gas and I'll come and help you. Why walk? And why not, why not phone somebody? She also makes a great argument to say, if you don't have gas, as the driver, why would you open the gas tank? Surely you open the gas tank to pour gas in, but if you don't actually have gas, why would you do that? You can see from the gas gauge that you don't have gas. You don't need to look into the tank to know that you don't have gas. And so isn't that staging? And so if someone staged it to look like he ran out of gas, well then they'd need to drain the gas out of the gas can. And who's well known for staging crime scenes here? Think about the scene involving Curtis Smith and the whole shot to Alex's head and at the end of this whole story. Do you think that was staged? If you think that was staged, do you think this was staged? What was similar about that to this? What was similar between this and that? Roadside? Instead of a flat tire, what is it? Running out of gas. And what happened in this case? Well, somebody got away with murder, it looks like. So the other thing to ask is, if Stephen was going somewhere to get gas, why did he leave his wallet in the car? And since he was found in the middle of the road 3 miles away from his vehicle, it looks like he was walking to get gas. That's what it looks like. That's how it's staged to appear. Problem is the nearest gas station is in the opposite direction. Next one. The phone didn't shatter and there was no glass. So Stephen Smith actually had his phone in his pocket and it was still in his pocket when they found him on the road. Screen still intact when Stephen Smith wasn't. And when you look at those incident photos and you look at the damage done to him, it's very hard to imagine that there wouldn't be damage done to his phone. There's not a scratch on his phone. There was not a sign of paint from a vehicle that supposedly hit him, no broken glass, no skid marks, none of the typical things. Also, as you probably heard before, Stephen Smith still had his shoes on and they weren't tied very tightly either. And typically in situations like this, victims are found not still wearing their shoes. Interestingly, Stephen's sister says there were problems with Stephen's vehicle that day in terms of the connections to his vehicle battery. Stephen also complained that the vehicle wouldn't crank. So was there quite a lot of effort to sabotage his vehicle from somebody? The next one, number 4, rumors about the Murdaugh boys. Stephen Smith was killed in 2015, Mallory Beach in 2019, 4 years later. Paul was basically responsible for Mallory's death. And a lot of people thought, wasn't Paul also responsible for Stephen Smith's death? And the surprise is that certainly in the HBO documentary that they talk about rumors, dozens of rumors, that Buster was possibly involved in what happened to Stephen. There's some accounts that there were several people involved, but one of the people who think that it may have been Buster is Stephen's mother, Sandy Smith. In a interview with Highway Patrol, she said it keeps coming up that it was the Murdaugh boys. Those are her words. There's also an audio recording where someone says, there's a rumor that one of my classmates did it, Buster Murdaugh.
Can you tell me what you heard about the Stephen Smith incident?
I just heard one saying things.
And who was that?
Buster Murdaugh.
If for no other reason, Buster was a classmate of Stephen Smith. His yearbook photo appears on the opposite page to Stephen's in the same magazine. You might say rumors and speculation mean nothing. Except the local highway patrol say the Murdaugh name came up at least a dozen times. And when it comes to the Murdaughs, there's a reason you would not really want to say anything. And so in relation to the Stephen Smith incident, a name keeps coming up. I've often said that you also want to look at the aftermath to something. And so what happened after Stephen Smith died? Where did Buster go? What did Buster do? Now, according to Stephen's sister, Stephen played baseball with Buster. Guess who coached that team? Guess who were the coaches of the baseball team that Buster was a part of? Alex Murdaugh and his father, Randolph Murdaugh. That brings us to the next point, the fifth point. Buster was supposed to go to law school after Stephen Smith's death. The whole idea was that he was going to follow in the family tradition. Instead, Stephen Smith dies and Buster kind of disappears. He doesn't go to law school, he just sort of disappears. There's talk that he may have gone overseas. Buster was 19 years old in 2015, and unlike Paul, he was the apple of his parents' eyes. Would it have mattered if there was any scandal surrounding Buster? Was Stephen somehow going to ruin everything? Stephen's sister says that in the 2 weeks prior to Stephen's death, that Stephen started acting more secretive. Stephen also seemed to be moving through more influential circles, and apparently he said, if people knew who I'm consorting with, it'll shake up the entire county.
He said he was messing with a man from Hampton County that was high in power and that everybody would be shocked at who it was. I think his words were, if I tell you who this is, the whole Hampton County is going to be shook.
So remember during the trial they spoke about circumstantial evidence. Well, here is some. Curiously, prior to Stephen's death, Stephen had planned to go deep-sea fishing during the 3rd week in July, that's just before his death, with a quote-unquote prominent person. But Stephen wouldn't say who it was. And so Stephen died before he could go deep-sea fishing, before he could accept that invitation to go deep-sea fishing. So if Stephen didn't receive blunt force trauma from being struck by a car, how was he struck? Well, perhaps by something like this. The HBO docuseries also is very careful not to cross a legal line, and they put some sort of fine print on the screen saying that although Buster's name was mentioned about 24 times in law enforcement interviews regarding the Stephen Smith case, he's not been charged with any crime and has not even been interviewed by law enforcement in connection with these crimes. The second part of that is pretty shocking. So anyway, if you ask me, the Murdaugh case still isn't over because what really happened to Stephen Smith remains unsolved. And now we look at some allegory. We look at what happened in 2021, a couple of months after Maggie and Paul were murdered. Curtis Smith, he was the man implicated in Alex's so-called attempt to end himself. He says he had no idea of any plot. He says that Alex never kind of approached him and said, this is what we're going to do. He said he felt like he's being set up. Well, how was he set up? Well, by the side of the road. But not because of no fuel, a flat tire. And I think you've got to ask the question, if there was a flat tire, and I think there was, because it was made to look like there was a flat tire, is it the same situation with the no fuel? Do you see how history may be repeating itself? When Murdaugh described the shooter, it bore zero resemblance to Curtis Smith. Given the timing of the whole thing, I suspect either Alex Murdaugh wanted to pin all of the shit on Curtis Smith. He wanted to say, you know what, don't suspect me of anything, suspect this guy. He's dirty, he's an ex-con, he's this, he's that. You know, either you should suspect me or you should suspect this guy in the murder of Maggie and Paul. And so, didn't he want to pin shit on someone? Didn't he want to blame someone else? In the falling of the housekeeper down the steps, the dogs were to blame. In the murder of Maggie and Paul, it was two vigilantes ultimately. Curtis was just the phantom third party, playing the phantom third party. In other words, all of this was a gaslighting sideshow to distract attention from Murdaugh, but also to blame someone else. And then, this is the bottom line. Think about personal injury insurance law. The whole point is that you somehow end up richer and better off in the midst of someone else's suffering. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.